Hello, everyone. Welcome to another installment of Authors at Google, and this one in San Francisco. Thanks for attending. Today, I'd like to welcome our guest, Alva Noë. There's a reasonably popular belief in both philosophy and science that consciousness, or the experience of being aware, is something that happens inside our brains and is reasonably disconnected from reality. There's what happens in our brains, and there's what happens in reality, and there's some sort of medium being interpreted. And Alva, in his new book, Out of Our Heads, Why You Are Not Your Brain, and Other Lessons from the Biology of Consciousness, challenges these assumptions that are underlying neuroscientific studies of consciousness. He argues that we're not our brains, that consciousness arises from interactions with our surroundings, and that it's not something just inside of us, something we do or make, and consciousness is inextricably linked from the inside to the outside of our brains. And according to Science News, among others, Alva Noë wants to knock the brain off its scientific pedestal, where it reigns as maestro of mind and king of consciousness. In his new book, Noë offers an often thought-provoking explanation of why neuroscientists won't make headway in understanding conscious experience until they drop their brain-centric attitudes. So in 8 illuminating yet jargon-free chapters, very accessible, he defines what scientists really know about consciousness, and makes a strong case that mind and awareness are processes that arise during a dynamic dance between the observer's surroundings and the mind. Noë begins with a sharp critique of scientists, such as Francis Crick, who insists that nothing but neurons determines our daily perceptions and sense of self. And a writer in philosophy at UC Berkeley, he's also a member for the Institute of Cognitive and Brain Sciences and the Center for New Media. And for the last decade or so, his philosophical practice has concerned perception and consciousness, and his current research focus is art and human nature. So with that, let's welcome to Authors at Google, Alva Noë.
Thank you very much. You've said so much of the talk, actually. No, I really appreciate that. That was a very generous introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. I'd like to begin by describing a kind of an everyday experience to just help fix for you some of what's going to concern me in this talk and in the book. Suppose you go to a gallery to look at art, and imagine you look at a painting by an artist whose work is unfamiliar to you. Imagine the work of this artist is in a style which is totally unfamiliar to you. So evoke that kind of experience, which you've probably had. It sometimes happens when you look at such a work of art that, well, you don't get it. Nothing happens. The picture seems flat, opaque, meaningless, indistinct, uninteresting. Your tendency is just to move on. But you don't move on. You look more. You stay with it. You think about it. Maybe the friend who brought you to the gallery is a great admirer of this artist, and she calls your attention to some visual details that you hadn't paid attention to, that you hadn't noticed. Maybe she tells you something about the motivations of the artist. You think about what you see in front of you, and sometimes something rather remarkable happens. The picture opens up. It discloses itself to you. Whereas before it was closed, now it is open. Whereas before it was sort of indistinct and meaningless, now you can discern structure, can perceive meaning in it. Whereas before it was uninteresting, now it grabs you, now it interests you. So some transformation has occurred, and I'm very interested in the nature of this transformation. Now, the first thing to notice about that transformation is that in some sense it's clearly a subjective transformation. The picture didn't change, right? If there's a change, it's a change in you. On the other hand, it's not a merely subjective change. It's not just that you now have different feelings about the picture in front of you. It's not just that you have different beliefs about the picture in front of you. You are now able to perceive the picture in front of you. You are now able to discern qualities, features, structures, meanings in the picture in front of you that you couldn't perceive before. So this transformation in you is a transformation that enables you first to perceive that which is there in front of you, that which was there all along. So I think there's actually a very good English language term for this transformation, and it's understanding. What happens is, through the exercise of in this case, your observation and your intellect, through paying attention, through thinking, through conversation, you come to understand, see connections, make sense of the thing in front of you, And that act of understanding brings the work of art into focus for you for the first time as an object for perceptual consciousness. Now, I'm not here to talk about art, but I mentioned this example because I think it actually brings to our attention a very basic and fundamental fact about all perceptual consciousness. In fact, I'd say that one of the reasons why art interests us as much as it does, one of the reasons why art matters to us as much as it does, is that it recapitulates what is really a basic fact about perceptual consciousness, which for the time being I'll just put like this. Understanding, skills, know-how, capacities, abilities bring the world into focus for consciousness. I'm focusing on a perceptual case, but I'm going to argue that this is true of all consciousness. The problem of consciousness is basically the question of how the world shows up for us. And a basic part of the story, I will argue, is that we bring knowledge, skill, techniques to the world and thus are able to pick things up and make contact with them. Now, to help you see why this claim is an important one, or why it's a novel one, let me contrast it with a different kind of view. There's an idea that what we see is what projects to the eyes and stimulates the brain. What is visible is what stimulates the retina and the brain. Okay? Now, I think I can actually show you pretty easily that that view is not satisfactory. And to do that, I'm going to show you a little demonstration. So if you can see the screen, if you can't see the screen from where you're sitting, please get up and move to where you can see it. Now, this is an image made by the perceptual psychologist Kevin O Regan, who is a member of the CNRS in France. It's a photographic image of a street scene in Paris, a woman, traffic in the background. Now, in fact, it's a QuickTime film. And as you've been watching this film, it has been changing. The changes are gradual. And so you probably didn't notice that the car behind the woman was blue when the movie started. And I'll just do it again. Now, if you were wearing computer-driven eye trackers, they would surely show that your eyes were moving over the surface of that part of the image. Your photoreceptors in your eyes were responding to the chromatic properties of that part of the scene, and correspondingly, your brain was being affected by that part of the scene. And yet, you did not experience the color of the car or the change in the color of the car. It didn't show up for you. You didn't notice it. Why not? Well, one of the things we can say is that you didn't notice it because you didn't expect it. You didn't notice it because you didn't ask the question, is the color of the car changing? You didn't notice it because you didn't pay any attention to that. But notice, you were sort of passively, your nervous system was passively responsive to it. And I think what this shows is it's not enough for something to show up, for a feature of the world around you to show up in your perceptual experience, for it to sort of register on your nervous system. That's only part of what's required. It's not sufficient to see something that it affect your nervous system. Now, in fact, not only is it not sufficient, I think the case can be made that it is not necessary either. Here's a very simple image that was actually used in an article that I wrote with Kevin O Regan. This is just an English language phrase. You see it, you understand it right away. The meaning pops out at you. Of course, the meaning is not there on the screen. The meaning is not there on the screen. What's on the screen are projected lines and shapes. You have a certain background knowledge that enables you to discern the meaning, which is there, but not because the meaning is affecting your nervous system. So not only is it the case that affecting your eyes and brain is not sufficient for seeing something, it's not necessary either. Actually, this slide also makes the previous point about sufficiency. Could I ask you to read it, please? The illusion of seeing. Well, what it actually says is the illusion of seeing. We don't really look. We kind of know what we expect to see. We make up our minds on the fly, and we don't really worry about the details. Seeing the way the world shows up for us is not just a matter of how the nervous system is affected, it's a matter of the way we probe and interrogate and question and interact with the world. So I said before that there's this one idea that the content of consciousness is what projects to the eyes in the visual case or to the brain in the more general case. And I said that's not the way we should think about the visible or the conscious. So how should we think about it? Well, the alternative view that I propose is that instead of taking our starting point is this idea that, well, the world projects to the eyes and then the events of seeing take place in our brain, let's instead think of what we experience as what is available to us from a place. Not what projects to the eyes, but what is available from a place. And each of us has access to the world around us based on skills and knowledge. I see much more than what projects to the eye. You know, when I hold the book, I have a sense of the back of the book as well. The back of the book shows up in my perceptual consciousness. As I look out at you now, the periphery of my visual field shows up in my perceptual consciousness. Not because I'm now looking at it or now focusing on it, but because it is now available to me. How is it available to me? Well, it's available to me because I now have the ability now to look and see it. So the world is there, and I have the skills to achieve access to it. Okay? And I want to say that is, when we ask ourselves the question, how does the world show up for us? What makes it the case that the world shows up for us? We need to think about the way in which we, as skill-possessing, embodied creatures who are already situated in an environment and sort of provided with a set of skills and also technologies, the question we need to ask is, how are we able actively to secure access to the world? Now, let me take a pause for a moment and try to put this into a broader context. Francis Crick is a name that is familiar to all of you. He was a great molecular biologist. He's one of the co-discoverers of the structure of the DNA molecule. You may not know that he spent the last portion of his life working on the neuroscience of consciousness. And in the mid-90s, writing in the journal Nature, he said the following, and let me just remind you that I am a professor of philosophy. He said the following. He said, "No longer need scientists sit idly by listening to the tedious arguments of philosophers perpetually disagreeing with each other. The problem of consciousness is now a scientific problem." Okay? Now, yes, the problem of consciousness is a scientific problem. That's my starting point. My starting point is that the fact that we think and feel and that a world shows up for us is a fact about us. We ourselves belong to the natural world, and it needs to be understood as part of nature. It needs to be comprehended as part of nature. It is a fitting subject for science. But that doesn't mean it's not also an important subject matter for philosophy. And what I would even like to go so far as to say is that I think Crick is really actually quite mistaken if he thinks that somehow he or his colleagues have transcended philosophy and left it in the dust as they go on to do natural scientific investigation. In fact, if you look at the kind of work that Crick and his colleagues did and are doing, I think that you can see at work in their research program the sort of guiding influence of a philosophy which happens to be sort of unreflected on and unquestioned. One way that comes out, I think, pretty nicely is in something Crick wrote a little bit later on in a popular book that he wrote about the problem of consciousness and the brain basis of consciousness. The title of the book was The Astonishing Hypothesis. And in this book, Crick wrote, this is an imprecise quotation, your thoughts, feelings, hopes, and desires, your personality, are nothing but the action of brain cells and their associated molecules. And he added, with a flourish, that this idea is so strange to the way of thinking of most people alive today that it can truly be called astonishing. Now, the thing I want to suggest to you is that the astonishing thing about Crick's remark is how astonishing it isn't. It is an old idea, one that at least goes back to Descartes, that there is inside each one of us a thing that thinks and feels and decides, that is the locus of consciousness. It is an old idea that each of us is identical to that thing inside of us. Now, Crick's proposal is that that thing inside of you that thinks and feels and decides, that thing inside of you which is conscious and which you are, is your brain. Descartes and others in the tradition have said it's something immaterial. It's your soul, or it's some kind of an immaterial soul substance. But what we have to realize is that we don't actually have any better idea today how the brain gives rise to consciousness than we do how an immaterial soul stuff does. And that's not just me saying that. That's, if there's one thing we now know, is that we don't really have even a sketch of what a theory of how the action of brain cells gives rise to consciousness would look like. We don't even have a back-of-the-envelope doodle of an idea about how it works. If you look at the brain is inscrutable to feeling. It's inscrutable to consciousness. We see brain events, but we don't yet understand what it is about a certain, say, set of neural activations which make those intrinsically visual, say, or intrinsically olfactory, or intrinsically emotional. We can make correlations, but the correlations are brute and unintelligible. So my thinking as a person trying to contribute to the sciences, maybe the reason why we can't look at these local neural events and explain consciousness in terms of them is because we're just pitching our explanatory project at the wrong level. We shouldn't ask, how does consciousness arise here? It doesn't arise here. We should say, what is the domain? We should ask, what is the domain where we can find an explanation? And the suggestion I've made in my work and in my collaborations with others is that we need to expand our account of the substrate in terms of which we try to frame a theory. And indeed, we need to expand it so far as to cross the boundary of the skull. Susan Hurley, who is a friend and teacher and collaborator of mine, now deceased, Susan used to say the skull is not a magical membrane. Causal processes cross that boundary. So why might it not be the case that the causal processes that give rise to consciousness are ones that cross that boundary? So the point is this. It really would be astonishing to say that consciousness is not something that happens in the brain, not because it happens in something immaterial, but because that's just the wrong way of thinking about consciousness. Consciousness, as I argue in the book, is not something that happens inside of us, in our brain or anywhere else. It is something we achieve. Consciousness is not like digestion. It is more like dance. And like anything we do or achieve, like dance, it depends on more than just things taking place inside us. It depends on a dynamic, on interaction, on our larger bodies, on our larger environment-dependent capacities, on our emplacement in a landscape of a particular kind, and indeed, ultimately, on other people as well. So what I try to do in this book is show how when we widen the domain that we're looking at, we can actually begin to get explanatory purchase on questions that have eluded explanation when we take a brain's eye view alone, right? Now, so I've summarized the basic idea of the book, that consciousness is not something that happens inside us, it's something we do. I've said to you that I'm writing this book to make a contribution to the science. One reason I say that is people sometimes think if you're criticizing neural reductionism, it must be because you're somehow anti-science or you're trying to make room for God. That's not my project. I want to criticize what I think is some unsatisfactory science, unsatisfactory because it's straitjacketed by some philosophical presuppositions of essentially a Cartesian sort. But I want to replace that with a positive idea that we need to begin to look at ourselves in dynamic interaction with the world around us, and that if we do that, we can actually offer explanations. Now, although in writing this book, I'm trying to contribute to the science, I wrote this book for a general audience, not just for the scientific community, but for people without that particular background. And I just want to say something about why I did that. One of the reasons I did it is just this feeling I have that there's such a dogmatic stranglehold of some of these ideas that I criticize in the scientific community that I want to bring in more people to discussion. I kind of want to try to open it up. If you think of cognitive science as a sort of big banquet, I want to throw the chair back from the table and invite newcomers to the discussion. But another reason, which is really sort of a further point, is that in a way, although, as Crick said, and as I agree, the problem of consciousness is a problem for science, it's not only a problem for science. We actually, I think, as people, have a stake in this question. How should we understand ourselves? One of the distinctive features of this establishment view is that we're sort of trapped inside our skulls. We're aliens in this environment where we find ourselves. All we've got to go on are these sort of little sparkles and flashes of stimulation that impinge on us at the periphery. And the world itself is this unknown kind of confabulation. And I want to suggest that actually that view, that sort of alienated picture of our nature, is not one which is supported by the science. It's one which, for kind of accidents of history, our science has tended to take for granted. But we can reject it. And the picture I try to offer in its place is one where we are really already at home in the world in ways that I try to explain in the book. Now, I think that I'd like to just take a couple of minutes to give you an example of the kind of explanatory achievement that I think the positive view I'm developing can allow us to make. And then I'll just end with one other, just mentioning another theme from the book, and then I hope we'll have a chance for some discussion. And the example I'd like to give is one that actually refers back to a sort of a very long and established literature in psychology on reversing and inverting spectacles. If you wear glasses, you know that the way glasses work is by bending light and bringing it to a focus in a different place than it otherwise would be. Well, people have designed very extreme spectacles that radically refract light, so much so as, say, to take light which is coming in from the left side of the visual field and to have it stimulate the eyes as if it were coming from the right side of the visual field. Now ask yourself the question, what happens if you put on left-right reversing spectacles? You might think, well, things on the left will look as if they're on the right, and things on the right will look as if they're on the left. But in fact, that is not what happens. If you put on the spectacles and look around, your experience becomes wildly distorted. Boundaries between objects seem unstable. Surfaces heave and flex. The visual world becomes chaotic and unstable. Now, why should that be? The light hasn't been distorted. The light hasn't been deprived of information. The local stimulation that the light is producing in your retina and in your brain has not been changed. What explains this kind of almost hallucinatory effect? Well, here's what has been changed. What has been changed is the way your sensory stimulation is affected by your own movement. Now moving your eyes or your head produce radically unexpected, surprising sensory events. And it turns out that being able to see depends not only on being affected by light in a certain way, but it depends on, roughly put, understanding the way your relation to the world, or in this case, your relation to objects in light, depends upon what you do. We all have a kind of knowledge of the way our own movements produce sensory change. If I walk towards an object, it looms in my visual field. If I blink, I modulate my relation to the object. If I move around it, its profile changes. If I put on the goggles, this knowledge is taken away, it is abrogated. Now, a very interesting fact is that for someone who wears the goggles for a long period of time and is encouraged to explore the environment and actively interact with things, trying to do manual tasks and things, gradually you get used to the goggles and things seem normal again. Things on the left come to look as if they're on the left again. Even though the object is causally affecting your visual system in the way an object on the right would have. That is, it's entering the eye as if it were on the other side, and it's stimulating the brain as if it were on the other side. So what has happened? Well, what's happened is you figured out the new patterns of dependence of how things look and what you do. you've got new knowledge, you've got new understanding, not conscious, not explicit, very practical, very bodily. You've gotten new knowledge that enables you to make sense of what you see. This new knowledge, which is a kind of sensory motor bodily knowledge, now allows you to bring the world into focus. Just as it's the same metaphor I used when talking about the picture at the beginning. Okay? So now let's step back and ask ourselves the question, what is it about the pattern of neural activation in the retina and the lateral nucleus and the visual cortex that explains why something looks as if it's on your visual left rather than on your visual right? You can't explain it if the only place you look for an answer is at the cellular events alone. It's not the cellular events that are determining the experience. It's the cellular events, together with the way they are coupled to a larger dynamic of skillful interaction with the world. That's the domain in which we can frame an explanation of visual consciousness. Can't look at the brain alone. Now let me say something just in case I haven't been clear. It is not my view that the brain is not necessary for consciousness. It is my view that the brain or the action of the brain alone is not sufficient for any phenomenon of consciousness. We need to look at the brain in a larger context. The brain in the larger context of the body and environment, and also the social cultural environment. That's a very important point. We're all, one of the things about human beings and people who work in sort of technology fields like this, like you, I think should be sensitive to this, we are a profoundly technological creature. We are a tool-using creature. Tools are designed, but we are tool designers by nature. The first record of tools in our lives goes back 80, 100,000 years. There are pictures in the archaeological record as far as 80,000 years ago. So our form of life as animals is a technological form of life. We are makers of dwellings, we are makers of tools, we are users of tools. What do tools do at the most fundamental level? What tools do is extend our bodies and extend our minds. How do they do this? They do it by giving us new skills to reach out and make contact with the world, new skills to bring phenomena into focus. My mother seems near to me now, she seems present to me now, even though she's in Florida, because I just pull out my phone and can call her. There's a kind of a sense in which the technology gives me skills of access. And we occupy a kind of a space of access, of differing ways that we can reach out and make contact with each other. Think of language, or think of symbolism. Symbolism allows me to write things down, articulate thoughts that I couldn't grasp without language, communicate them to people who are beyond the range of my voice, communicate them to people who may not even be alive now, right? So if we want to understand the scope of consciousness, if we want to understand the scope of experience, we need a kind of more ecological perspective. The brain matters, but we need to look at the brain in the context of our ecology. And ours is an ecology of technology and other people and very specific kinds of environments in which we find ourselves. So now, in the book, I end up looking at a number of specific examples of that and of neural phenomena to show the way we can sort of begin to make sense of how the brain works only by situating it in this larger context. But I just wanted to share with you one last thought from the book, which is on a slightly different theme, and I'll close with that. And it's a very simple thought, but I think it's profoundly challenging. And the idea is this. In a way, the really challenging, most puzzling question when we think about consciousness is who and what is conscious, and how do we know? I'm conscious. Is my son conscious? Yes. Are you conscious? Yes. My coworker is yes. What about my dog? What about Barack Obama's dog? I actually got a phone call from the New York Times yesterday asking me whether Barack Obama's dog knows that he's famous. Well, I was interviewed for that article. They ended up not quoting me. I just said, no, he doesn't know. That's right. It was an article in the science section in today's Times. Who's conscious? Is the paramecium conscious? How do we decide? And when you begin to ask this question, we come up against two striking facts. The first is that most of the evidence on the basis of which we can make these kinds of judgments, most of the evidence is very weak. We make judgments on the basis of what people say and do, or what animals do, how they behave, or physiology. But the logic of the inferences is always very weak. There's nothing in what we measure that guarantees that it's accompanied by experience. I had an interesting personal reminder of this when my son, who was 4 at the time, had a hernia operation. I said to I was trying to be a careful, a loving father, so I said to the anesthesiologist, "Can you assure me that he won't suffer any discomfort during the operation?" And he said, "Oh yes, don't worry. I'll keep my eyes on his face throughout the procedure, and I'll monitor his blood pressure." Now, I was actually delighted to know that he'd be paying attention. And I actually felt reassured because of that. On the other hand, I was reminded of how crude the methods or technologies are for keeping track of what a person is feeling, okay? So and this is a big issue. If you start looking at brain injury or the persistent vegetative state and how we manage these things, the question of how we know about what's going on in the experience of another person is a sort of a really, really challenging thing to think about. So the first claim I want to suggest to you is that the basis for our attribution of mind to others is rather weak. And then the other point that I want to share with you is that however weak it is, you'd have to be insane to actually doubt that your loved ones, that your coworkers, that your friends, that your pet lack consciousness. You'd have to be insane to really call that into question. So on the one hand, we don't really have very good reasons, and on the other hand, we don't really take seriously the fact that we don't have good reasons. How do we understand that? And what I want to suggest to you is that I think part of what's going on there is that, in fact, the ground of our commitment to the minds of others is not actually a theoretical commitment. It's not actually on the basis of evidence. That others have minds, that others are points of view, that others understand and perceive and think and feel, and that a world shows up for them, is in a way a presupposition of the kinds of projects and work that we undertake with them, of the kind of lives we lead with them. This is true when we think cross-species. I've spoken to animal trainers who notice that they can't make any progress training a dog, say, to be a search and rescue dog or a seeing eye dog, if they think of the dog as a kind of mere machine. In order to train the dog, they need to work with the dog. In order to work with the dog, they need to enter into a relationship with the dog, a relationship which is naturally characterized in terms of trust, communication, understanding, obeying, not obeying, a highly morally laden, significant language. And the point about that then is this. Mind, as a natural phenomenon, is something that only really shows up for us, is only clearly visible and detectable when we are involved, when we are engaged, when we are near to. But at the same time, the aim of science is objective judgment, distance, detachment, measurement, precision. So how can there be, this is the question I want to pose, how can there be a science of the mind if, on the one hand, mind only comes up when we're involved and engaged, it only gets into focus for us, and yet that very kind of engagement is sort of incompatible with the scientific standpoint? Well, what I want to argue is it's not incompatible with the scientific standpoint, but we need to think very hard as scientists, as philosophers, as human beings, about what our conception of the stance of the science is from which mind as a phenomenon can be studied. And the thought I want to end with is this. There is a stance that is available to us that allows us to bring mind into focus as a natural phenomenon and investigate it empirically, and that is the standpoint of biology, but not the standpoint of molecular biology or cellular biology, but the standpoint of something like an ecological biology, or if you like, of evolutionary theory. When we talk about why a creature has evolved a trait, we say the trait is adaptive. We say the trait enhances fitness. To make that kind of a claim, we need to look at the animal in relation to its environment, to its situation. We need to think about the animal at the level of the animal, at the level of the trait, not at the level of just cells. And I want to say that a similar move needs to be made when we think about mind. We need to think about mind at the ecological level, at the level of the whole organism in its dynamic relation to the environment, including the cultural environment. And with that, I'll conclude, and I'll thank you very much for your attention.
So we'll now take questions from the audience. VCs, if you have questions, please speak up. I'll start passing the mic around, but I do have one question, so I guess we'll start with that. I would imagine your philosophy obviously would apply to that not all consciousness are created equal, that maybe a dog's consciousness is lower than one person's consciousness, or that there's some sort of spectrum. And correct me if that's wrong. But assuming there is a spectrum, how does your definition of consciousness intuitively reflect someone that most people would say has a higher consciousness, and someone or something that most people would say have lower consciousness? How does your theory translate those two extremes?
Well, I mean, in a way, it's actually pretty easy for the theory to accommodate that kind of distinction. Suppose you walk into a room and there's a bit of graffiti on the wall. Maybe it's really offensive graffiti, but it's in a language you don't know. You don't get it. It doesn't bother you. It doesn't disturb you. Now suppose it's in a language you do know. Your heart starts to pound. Your face turns red. You look around for who you can complain to. Two very different reactions that depend on what you can do and on your background. And that, I think, is an example of the difference between higher and lower consciousness. That is, what we can do, what we know how to do, opens up the world for us. And as you go down the evolutionary chain, what we know how to do just gets more and more primitive. And so in a way, to the lower forms of consciousness, there are worlds of less interest and significance.
So do you also include a definition, or at least include room for what some people would say, like, for example, that a Buddhist monk has higher consciousness? I imagine his tools and filters would be like meditation or some sort of greater understanding. But do you, I mean, the problem of lower consciousness, I think, is a lot easier for most of us to accept than the higher consciousness, because that's kind of a judgment call, depending on what you feel is a higher consciousness. But do you address that problem of like a truly like far above normal consciousness, or what humans could maybe aspire to reach in a millennia, something like that?
Well, as somebody who doesn't have the relevant form of higher consciousness, I'm not really sure what to say about it. It's not it's not one of the topics of my view to address the questions about the kind of cultivated mindfulness skills that you see in say, Buddhist meditators. What I will say, though, is this. I just want to at least raise a question about that. One of the things that's sometimes said about meditators is that they, in this Buddhist tradition, and let me just say again, it's not my expertise, but is that they have a certain kind of detachment from the everyday. So an example that I heard recently mentioned on the radio, maybe some of you heard it too, was somebody said that they looked at a Buddhist monk in an fMRI scanner, and they presented him with a blood-curdling shriek. And they noticed that he responded to the blood-curdling shriek the way we would respond to the lighting of a candle in a brilliantly sunlit room. In other words, it was just this kind of vague little disturbance. Now, is that higher consciousness? It's definitely an interesting kind of difference. I'm not sure I would say that's higher.
I was wondering if you could talk about the implications of what you're saying for artificial intelligence. It seems to me like just being a computer is not going to do it. Whatever the artificial intelligence is would have to have some kind of interaction with the environment, some kind of nervous system. It's not enough to just be inside a box with a rule set.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So I don't know if that got picked up for the rest of you, but what are the implications of this kind of perspective for artificial intelligence? And I'm very interested in the artificial intelligence research program. I think, in a way, as Daniel Dennett has argued, some of the most interesting philosophical reflections about the nature of mind have taken place in the context of the sort of engineering problems that the AI research programs face. I think that one of the more I think the moral that I take from it is that if you want to make an intelligent robot, what you really need to do is create something which is capable of a certain kind of interaction with the world. Now, just for the reasons we were talking about before when we talked about higher and lower forms of consciousness, that may mean that the way to make an intelligent robot is to start off by sort of making worlds for it, worlds that are sort of appropriate to what it can do, and let these worlds and robots co-develop and see if they can couple to each other in the ways that is characteristic of all living beings and indeed of all creatures with minds. So one of the thoughts I have is that it may be that the best strategy to pursue in creating artificial minds is essentially to try to create artificial lives, that there's a kind of complexity and interdependence of living organisms and their environments which is essential for what we find, what we discover as mind. And I think that's an idea that is taken seriously by some people working in the robotics laboratories now. I have a point in the book where I say people have always tried to make robots that are good calculators, that are good sort of figurers out, that, you know, the sense, plan, act model of what the project of a robot is. But in the book I say, we're not going to create robots with minds like ours unless we create robots with habits like ours, where habits mean a kind of environment and situation dependent, sort of natural way of doing things.
You can just repeat the question. Right? So
Okay, yeah.
I sort of wonder, when you talk about the sort of imprecision of the very question about higher and lower, perhaps there's a spectrum, but it's not necessarily high and low. Is there something uniquely human about the type of consciousness that you're consumed by? Because, you know, to say that a dog or, you know, a tree or some other living being, we often talk about them as sentient versus non-sentient beings, right? And yet we're saying we don't really know how to measure, right, if somebody is conscious or not, or the level of consciousness. It seems that the type of consciousness that we're talking about is something that's humanly perceptible, that we can relate to. And therefore, how do we really know that somebody else is not conscious, right? Because it's almost like we speak English, and they may speak something else, but we can only understand English, right? Sort of go back to the Hebrew example. And I was sort of taken back to an example where I was sitting in the hospital with my father, who was in coma, and, or at least he was not conscious. I don't know if he was in coma or not, but they told me he wasn't conscious. And he was on his deathbed, and I had a long conversation with him because I felt like I needed to talk to him. And after about 8 days, he came back, and he recalled the entire conversation. So was he conscious? They told me he was not conscious, but yet he recalled the conversation. So, you know, there's this notion about what do we mean by consciousness? He was technically unconscious, but he was perceiving something. And so, you know, it's just this notion of, is there a kind of human-centric, anthropomorphic understanding of what we mean by consciousness?
Yeah, that's the question I was trying to touch on in the last portion of my, that's the cluster of issues that I was trying to touch on in the last portion of my remarks, and I have a chapter in the book that looks at this. You know, the case you mentioned, the kind of medical case you mentioned, is especially poignant because patients, families, turn to their doctors for guidance about how to think about what's going on. And so often we actually don't get the guidance that we need because the knowledge simply is not there. You know, patients in persistent vegetative state show all sorts of behavioral signs of responsiveness. You know, loud noises attract their attention. They look at you, they smile, they cry. And yet you're told they're just vegetables. These are kind of vegetative, automatic responses. Sometimes parents or loved ones are unwilling to accept that verdict. And then the culture at large sometimes makes fun of them and says, you know, they're clinging to some pre-scientific view. On the other hand, a very interesting fact is that there are cases, not many, but there are cases where people have awoken from what was classified as vegetative state. Now, one of the interesting neurological markers of persistent vegetative state is a sort of a generally low-level reduction of metabolic activity in the brain. And it turns out that tests on people who've recovered from the persistent vegetative state continue to show them to have markedly reduced metabolic activity in the brain. Now, there are differences, and scientists are trying to look and see if there are issues about connectivity or if there are some kind of functional markers that make that difference. But the truth of the matter is we don't know. And with all the imaging technologies and so on that we now have, we don't know. And what that means is that for somebody like you in relation to your father, or for, if you remember the Terry Schiavo case, I mean, these are moral problems in a way before they are scientific problems. You know, the thing about people who are in this situation is that they're simply unwilling to treat their loved one as something which is a conjecture. It's not a conjecture. My commitment to you is not based on having, you know, watched you and decided on the basis of the way you've acted all your life that I think, well, it's a pretty good bet that you're conscious. No, I don't put that question. For me to put that question of a person who's near to me would be kind of disrespectful. I mean, by the way, this is why I think the movie Blade Runner is a very interesting investigation of human consciousness. Because what the movie Blade Runner does is it portrays a situation in which there's an official cultural ideology according to which a certain class of beings are, because they're artificial, or at least partially artificial, aren't accorded the rights of others. And yet everybody in the movie kind of in their heart knows that they're no different. That is, the fact that they were created just simply doesn't make the difference. And so that when the Harrison Ford character, who's a sort of a cop whose job it is to catch runaway replicants, runaway robots, his unwillingness to acknowledge the humanity of the replicants, what it effectively does narratively in the movie is call his own humanity into question, in a sort of a little pun on the term humanity. So now, is this an anthropomorphic kind of perspective? I guess I don't see that. I think we can ask ourselves, we all have a world. That is to say, we're not just kind of like ping pong balls responding to the forces acting on us. The world shows up for us. You see me, I see you. We see the colorful room that we're in. We're listening to there's a whole landscape of colors, shapes, ideas, problems that are confronting each of us now. And I think we can ask, does a world show up for a dog? It's not going to be the same world. Does a world show up for a chimpanzee? It's not going to be the same world. I mean, it's the same physical world, but in terms of the meanings and valences and values, and it's going to be a very different world. Like if you think of the monkey case, a very complex world. You know, monkeys live in highly structured social groups they exhibit fantastic sensitivity to power hierarchies and also to kinship relations. People will treat one monkey differently depending on their relation to another monkey and some recognition of triangles. Now, people who study animal minds debate what kind of conception of mind or conception of the other does a monkey have, and we can debate about it. But what I think is clear is that a world shows up for the monkeys, and we can ask how. And what I'll say about the monkey is the same thing I'll say about us. The brain isn't ever going to be the whole story. What we're talking about is an ecology, as a context, as a situation, as a dynamic. The monkey brain, the chimpanzee brain, the dog's brain, the human brain are necessary for the kinds of consciousnesses that we have. They are constraints on the kind of lives we can lead, but they're never the whole story.
Do we have any questions from the VC audience? No? I'll finish with one more question. I assume neurobiologists and neuroscientists aren't just going to accept your theory with no argument. Do you know some of the common criticisms, at least some of the criticisms you're going to expect from the community? Do you have responses for them yet? Or are you fairly confident that the scientists will intuitively recognize the validity of this argument?
That's, you're asking me to sit here and sort of give the best arguments against my view?
Yes, yes I am.
That's good. I won't do it. No, the truth is, I've been at this for a while. Sort of, in a way, I kind of come out of this. There's now in the world a very vital community of neuroscientists and philosophers and psychologists and roboticists and AI people who meet at the same conferences and argue with each other. So I work, you know, cheek by jowl with people who have very, very strongly different views from me. So that's one comment I'll make. Another comment I'll make is that, in fact, while there is this orthodoxy that I'm criticizing, there are other streams of thought that don't belong to the orthodoxy, and there's a kind of a heterodoxy, and I view myself very much as coming out of and responsive to antecedents, both in philosophy and in neuroscience. So, for example, the neurobiologist Francisco Varela, or the cognitive vision perception psychologist J.J. Gibson, and some of the collaborators who I mentioned. Kevin O Regan is an empirical scientist in France, or Susan Hurley, my philosophical colleague. I'm not alone in this fight. And there is now in the cognitive science community at large a very clear recognition that, that brain, body, and environment are important for understanding ourselves. I think the strongest kind of conceptual objection that's made to my view is that we can make a distinction between sort of causally necessary factors and that which is constitutive of the processes that interest us. So people will say, look, the environment, sure, it causes, we causally depend on it for the kinds of experiences we have, but the experiences happen in us. So we can make a distinction between the fact that stimulation from the environment is necessary for me to have an experience, and the idea that somehow the environment is part of the causal machinery responsible for the experience. And do you understand the point there? So the significance of this is that I think that it's really just kind of a sort of an intellectual prejudice that has led people to assume that the skin is the relevant marker between what's constitutive and what's merely sort of external to the system guiding it. And the best way I can think to bring this out is we ask ourselves, see, the picture that the opposition has is the world produces experiences in me by affecting my brain. And it's the brain that gives rise to the experience, however the effects in the brain are brought about. It happens to be brought about by the world, but in a virtual reality situation, you could have it brought about in different ways. But it's the brain that's doing all the work. And I flip it around. I say, in fact, the brain is inscrutable. We don't really understand what the brain is doing unless we view the brain as playing a mediating role in relation to the world. So what makes a part of the brain the visual cortex, which is a functional notion? Well, I think it's the fact that it governs or plays a role in governing a certain kind of dynamic with the world, a dynamic that requires the participation of the world. So this is a big argument, but the promise, I think, is for the emergence of a cognitive science that makes room for the place of the brain in the story, but that doesn't try to eliminate higher levels of description and explanation, a sort of a contextual cognitive science, one that looks at organisms in their environmental, behavioral, cultural, phylogenetic, historical context. And that's where I think we're going to really make progress understanding ourselves. I just want to end with one final thought. The epigram for the book is a line from a Delmore Schwartz poem, which goes like this: I no more wrote than read that book, which is the self I am. I no more wrote than read that book, which is the self I am. So I think we are, we care about the outcome of this debate. I speak as somebody who wants ourselves as a phenomenon of the natural world to be understood, but I want to challenge not only the scientific community, but the public at large to realize how much is at stake and how we think about ourselves and our nature. So I thank you.